300 individuals were observing my spouse as he gripped a microphone and transformed me into the evening's laughingstock. "Let us open the bidding at $20, he proclaimed, beaming at the gathered crowd as though he had just delivered the most hilarious joke of the entire event. "Who is willing to take this good-for-nothing wife off my hands?" The giggling erupted instantly, sweeping across the grand room as if the guests had simply been waiting for a green light to unleash it. A person standing near the drinks counter lifted a bidding sign solely to prolong the joke and keep the amusement alive. I remained standing right there, clad in the elegant blue gown I had purchased specifically for this celebration, and I chose not to shed a single tear. I did not engage in an argument. I merely kept my eyes fixed on him. Suddenly, an individual's voice rang out from the very back of the hall, declaring, $2 million. In that instant, absolutely everything ground to a halt. I wish to recount the journey of how I ended up in that exact position, standing on top of an elevated platform before every single person we knew. This situation did not materialize out of a solitary moment. It developed gradually over the span of 27 years, disappearing piece by piece like a small eraser wearing away, until I grew so accustomed to being completely unnoticed that I barely perceived the specific evening it became formalized. I had dedicated the entire afternoon to organizing that charity event. Every single table arrangement, every individual seating assignment, and every single telephone discussion with the food provider who continuously miscalculated the guest numbers, all of that was my responsibility. I had been managing these responsibilities for 11 years. Starting from the moment Gregory's philanthropic organization expanded significantly enough to require a professional event rather than a simple backyard gathering. I never once requested any acknowledgement for my efforts. I convinced myself that it was perfectly acceptable, believing that certain individuals operate out of sight while others occupy the spotlight. And I had come to terms with the specific role I filled. Gregory turned up 40 minutes past the scheduled time, just as he routinely did these days, entering the room with that effortless grin that caused surrounding crowds to adjust themselves around his presence. He planted a kiss on my cheek, right in front of the organization's executives, offering a comment regarding how I constantly managed to coordinate everything successfully, and subsequently spent the following hour claiming credit for all the decisions I had made entirely on my own, right down to selecting the specific wine. Time was when that used to upset me. By the previous year, I practically did not care anymore. It is genuinely astonishing what a human being can adapt to over time. It was over the course of the main meal that the mocking remarks commenced, following the predictable pattern once he had consumed a few servings of the high-quality alcohol he preferred to keep close at hand during these gatherings. He informed the individuals at our table that I was old-fashioned, mentioning that I still calculated a financial ledger completely by hand, and noting that I had likely never transmitted a written electronic message exceeding 4 words in length. Everyone present chuckled. I maintained a smile because that is the expected behavior in such moments, and I offered the bread container to Mrs. Alderman, who gently patted my hand as though she felt deep pity for me, an action that somehow hurt worse than the actual mocking comment. "She is absolutely the most boring lady in this entire room," Gregory announced at a particular moment, speaking loudly enough for occupants of 3 separate tables to overhear. "And I declare that, with deep affection." He routinely appended that concluding phrase, "with affection," as if it functioned as a valid transaction voucher that rendered the entire hurtful interaction acceptable. I do not possess precise knowledge of exactly when the concept of the bidding began. I believe the idea originated with Gregory's corporate associate, Tom, who regularly conducts these charitable bachelor bidding segments at alternative functions, offering dates and meals alongside minor local public figures. It was all intended as innocent amusement, entirely dedicated to a beneficial purpose. I suspect an individual proposed that it would be highly amusing to replicate the segment using already married pairs instead. I assume Gregory considered the concept to be absolutely wonderful. I clearly recall him clutching my hand midway through the final course, pulling me upward onto the elevated platform they had constructed for the musical performers. And I remember reflecting in the brief instant before I comprehended what was transpiring, that perhaps he intended to offer a celebratory toast, share an important piece of news, or speak a heartfelt truth. On the contrary, he seized the sound equipment from the musical coordinator, placed his remaining hand upon my shoulder as though I were an item of household furniture he was putting on display, and uttered the precise phrases that brought an end to 27 years of me pretending that I failed to see what was happening. Let us begin the offer at $20. The entire room erupted in laughter, matching the specific way a crowd giggles when they have consumed a sufficient amount of alcohol and maintain complete faith in the individual commanding the microphone. I scanned the room, looking at 300 individual countenances of people I had personally welcomed, provided food for, remembered the birth dates of, and transmitted handwritten expressions of gratitude to. Every single one of them was chuckling at the sight of me being put up for sale for $20, treated precisely like a joke item at a holiday gift swap. I chose not to flee from the elevated platform. I did not fling my beverage directly into his face, even though a tiny, exhausted component of my being desperately desired to do so. I merely stood in that exact spot, keeping my back perfectly straight and my fingers clasped together, allowing the event to unfold. I behaved this way because I had discovered a significant time ago that personal honor is the solitary attribute a room packed with mocking individuals cannot strip from you, provided you do not actively hand it over to them yourself. An individual situated toward the rear of the space raised a bidding sign as a playful gesture. $20, they shouted out, prompting a handful of additional guests to giggle. Immediately following that, the entire hall fell profoundly silent all at once, in the exact manner a space quietens when an authentic element breaks through a completely artificial display. $2 million. The remark originated from the back area, delivered in a peaceful, unhurried tone. It was the precise type of voice that has never required an elevated volume to command attention. Every single head inside that event space shifted direction at the exact same moment. Gregory's fingers slipped away from my shoulder, as though his hand had instantly turned completely freezing. I scanned the assembled crowd and located him standing right by the entryway, a tall gentleman dressed in a charcoal suit, whom I failed to recognize, observing me with a facial expression I was not yet capable of interpreting. It was not a look of pity, nor was it amusement. It was something far closer to profound admiration. A fact that bewildered me to a greater extent than any other occurrence throughout the evening. I had absolutely never encountered this individual at any point in my existence. Gregory emitted a brief, anxious chuckle and muttered something regarding a highly charitable benefactor, yet absolutely no one was paying attention to his words any longer. The gentleman clad in gray had already initiated his walk toward the elevated platform. Moving without any rush, the entire gathering of guests divided around his path, as though he were the solitary individual in the space who carried any significance. For reasons I could not explain to myself, I detected my pulse starting to race. This was not driven by terror, but rather by an abrupt and unusual realization that my entire existence was on the verge of transforming, and I possessed completely no influence over the manner in which it would occur. He came to a stop a small distance from the elevated platform and gazed at me in the precise way a person looks at an item they have been tracking down for an incredibly extended duration. From a closer vantage point, he appeared older than my initial impression suggested, perhaps around 60 years of age, possessing silver hair at his temples, and the specific type of serene stillness that caused every other person in the vicinity to appear excessively loud by comparison. He completely avoided looking at Gregory. He directed his gaze entirely at me. "My identity is Daniel Whitmore," he stated, and I caught a subtle, synchronized breath drawn by the audience behind my position, as it seemed that specific identity carried a great deal of weight for every individual in the hall, except for myself. "I sincerely trust you will pardon my sudden intrusion." Gregory was the first to regain his speaking ability. Moving forward with his arm extended and that commercial salesman's smile clicking instantly back into position like an electrical toggle. "Daniel Whitmore. Assuredly, we are deeply privileged. We had no realization you would be participating with us this evening. Your charitable support toward our organization is—" "I did not arrive for the benefit of your organization," Daniel remarked. His tone remained entirely peaceful and perfectly steady. However, an element within his delivery caused Gregory's arm to retreat back to his flank without any handshake taking place. "I arrived solely because I was informed your spouse would be present at this location." The room had turned so profoundly quiet that I could distinctly perceive the sound of frozen cubes shifting inside an individual's drink container 3 tables away. Gregory chucked once more, producing that identical anxious utterance, and threw a glance toward my position, as if he anticipated that I would clarify the circumstances or present a narrative that clarified why an unfamiliar gentleman was volunteering $2 million for a mocking stunt he had initiated himself. "I beg your pardon. Have the two of you previously met, Angela? Are you acquainted with Mr. Whitmore?" "No," I responded, because it was the absolute truth, and because across 27 years I had never once provided Gregory with a cause to mistrust my statements, and I had no intention of beginning that behavior in front of 300 guests. Daniel shifted his focus entirely to me in that moment, and an element in his countenance grew gentle, matching the way an individual's expression softens when they finally arrive at their destination after an incredibly protracted road trip. "Mrs. Simmons, I am well aware that this situation must appear highly unusual. I give you my word, it is completely different from how it appears." He took a brief pause, directed a single glance at the sound equipment still dangling loosely from Gregory's fingers, and subsequently looked right back at me. "Would you grant me permission to escort you to a meal tomorrow evening? I hold a matter that I absolutely must communicate to you, and it is not the sort of information that belongs inside a space like this one." I ought to have declined the offer. Every single reaction mechanism I had spent multiple decades cultivating instructed me to utter a refusal, to smooth over the awkwardness of the situation, and to safeguard the success of Gregory's event, even following the treatment he had just subjected me to upon that elevated platform. However, I fixed my eyes upon Daniel Whitmore's countenance, and I detected an element present there that had not been aimed at my person in a far longer duration than I could actively recall. It was completely devoid of pity, free of amusement, and entirely different from the gentle, accommodating fondness Gregory presented to me on his more favorable days. I observed genuine respect, completely straightforward and entirely unashamed. "Very well," I uttered. Tomorrow evening. The hushed murmurs commenced before our feet had even departed from the elevated platform. I could catch disconnected scraps of the talk as Gregory steered me back toward our designated seating, keeping a palm pushed entirely too firmly against my spine. "Who exactly is that individual? Are you familiar with him? $2 million dedicated to her?" I comprehended in a detached fashion that I had suddenly transformed into the most fascinating occurrence to take place at one of Gregory's charity events in 11 years, and it was completely unrelated to any purpose he would have ever picked himself. He restrained himself until we were situated inside the vehicle, the parking receipt still resting inside his coat pocket. Prior to demanding the answer to the query I could sense intensifying within his being during our entire journey down inside the lift. "Are you acquainted with him?" His tone was incredibly strained, highly controlled. He sounded like a man putting forth immense effort to appear as though he harbored no anxiety whatsoever. "No, Gregory, I provided you with the absolute truth back in that room. I have never encountered the man." $2 million, Angela, dedicated to a mere joke. That is completely abnormal. That is not something ordinary people do. He clenched the steering apparatus, as though the vehicle itself owed him a logical explanation. "What exactly occurred? Did you cross paths with him at the medicine store, the food market, or a similar location?" "I possess absolutely no concept of who he is," I stated once more, and I genuinely meant the words, even though a piece of my mind had already started investigating the events of the evening like turning over a rock, searching for the hidden side of the situation, the specific element I had failed to observe thus far. He refused to accept my explanation. I could discern this fact through the specific way he fell entirely silent for the remainder of the trip home. Furthermore, once we arrived back at our residence, he retreated completely into his private workspace instead of coming upstairs to retire for the night. I remained awake for an incredibly long duration that evening, staring directly at the room ceiling, repeatedly replaying the precise tone of that voice ringing out from the back area of the hall, $2 million, and attempting to position it somewhere within my past recollections. The memory simply did not exist. I had truly never laid eyes on the gentleman before. What I remained completely unaware of, as I rested in that bed with the illumination from my spouse's workspace still throwing a faint glow beneath the doorway down the corridor, was that Gregory had already placed a phone call to Margaret, his personal corporate assistant, right from the vehicle. I was completely unaware that he had instructed her to uncover every single piece of information she could possibly locate regarding Daniel Whitmore prior to the start of the working day, his corporate transactions, his history of marriages, and above everything else, any potential link whatsoever between his identity and my own. I most certainly did not possess the knowledge that by the time the morning light appeared, Margaret would contact Gregory back with information that disturbed his composure to a far greater extent than an extramarital relationship ever could. Definitive documentation that Daniel Whitmore had been quietly hunting for a lady by the name of Angela Simmons for multiple years. Daniel selected a tiny eating establishment I had never previously heard of, nestled into a peaceful roadway situated far away from the regular spots Gregory and I frequented. The specific variety of dining place where the individual tables are positioned at a sufficient distance from one another to ensure that all discussions remain strictly confidential. He rose to his feet the moment I entered the space, an act of courtesy that virtually no one performed for me these days, and moved my seating out before the establishment host could even manage to reach it. For a prolonged duration after our food selections had been recorded, he chose not to speak. He merely gazed at my face across the flickering candle flame with a specific facial expression I still lacked a proper term to describe. "I desire to offer a sincere apology for the events of last night," he finally remarked. "I am well aware that it must have appeared excessively dramatic. That was absolutely not my goal. I have simply been putting forth effort to track you down for a very long span of time, and the moment I observed the actions your husband was taking, I found it impossible to remain a bystander and allow it to occur. You still have not explained to me the manner in which you are familiar with my person," I stated. "I have reviewed every single year of my existence since our meal commenced, and I am entirely unable to locate your presence in any of them." "You would not possess a memory of me," he replied. "However, I believe that if I share the narrative with you, it might cause you to recall a different individual. He drew a deliberate, slow breath, matching the specific way people behave when they are on the verge of uttering words they have practiced internally for multiple years. 30 years in the past, you were employed as a young teacher at a primary educational facility. Do you possess a recollection of a drizzly afternoon sometime during the autumn season when you discovered an adolescent girl weeping outside the downtown transit terminal? An element shifted deep inside my chest, mimicking the sound of a door grinding open into a space I had failed to visit for multiple decades. There was a young lady, I uttered in a slow manner. She was perhaps 15 or 16 years old. She was drenched completely through by the weather. I very nearly failed to stop my vehicle. I had student assignments requiring evaluation. I was thoroughly worn out. It was raining heavily, yet she appeared completely terrified. I could picture her features right now with far greater clarity than I had originally anticipated. Huddled closely beneath the protection of the transit terminal covering, dressed in a coat entirely too thin for the chilly climate, jumping slightly every single time an automobile reduced its speed near the edge of the walkway. I treated her to an evening meal. I distinctly recall that detail. It was some ordinary dining spot located a few blocks away. Her first name was Rachel, Daniel stated, and his speaking voice faltered just a tiny bit as he uttered the specific name. Rachel Whitmore. She was my younger sister. I placed my eating utensil flat on the table. The entire dining establishment appeared to turn completely silent around our positions. She had fled entirely from our stepfather's residence, Daniel went on to explain. The circumstances inside that household were completely unsafe. I was already an adult residing on the opposite side of the nation, and I remained completely unaware of how severe the situation had turned until a much later date. Until the circumstances had very nearly become irreversible. Rachel communicated to me multiple years down the road that her explicit intention that evening was to step onto a transit vehicle and completely vanish. She harbored absolutely no concern regarding the final destination of the vehicle. She merely desired to be completely removed from her life. He took a brief pause, and I observed him regain his composure prior to proceeding with his words. And in that moment, an absolute stranger took a seat right next to her person in the heavy rain and inquired if she required something to eat. I recalled a greater amount of information at this moment, such as remaining by her side long past the hour when I ought to have returned to my own residence. I remembered placing a phone call to a female colleague I placed deep confidence in at the County Administrative Social Services Bureau, deliberately choosing her over the standard emergency contact line. I visualized myself remaining seated in a rigid, uncomfortable plastic seat at 2 o'clock in the morning, refusing to leave until a dependable individual arrived to escort the young girl to a location that was completely secure. I recollected dropping by to see her at the temporary residential home on a handful of occasions following that event, delivering reading materials and monitoring her academic performance. I recalled eventually drifting apart as time moved forward, the way life continuously progresses forward in the manner it routinely does. I assisted her in completing her secondary education, I remarked in a soft tone. We exchanged written updates for a span of a few years, but subsequently I entered into my marriage, relocated to 2 different cities, and I feel deeply remorseful to admit that I completely lost track of her whereabouts. I find myself reflecting on her situation on occasion. I continuously speculated about how her life unfolded. She transitioned into a practicing attorney, Daniel explained, and an element resembling immense pride broke through the underlying sorrow present in his speaking voice. She dedicated herself primarily to legal advocacy for children within the temporary care system, She established a nationwide charitable structure centered entirely around that cause. This included residential homes, legal assistance for young individuals transitioning out of institutional custody, and urgent temporary shelters. She was accustomed to stating that the entire enterprise originated inside a basic dining spot with an absolute stranger who harbored no obligation to pause her life, yet chose to do so. He extended his arm into his outerwear and placed a paper container upon the surface between our positions, completely sealed. She lost her life 8 months ago due to cancer. Close to the final moments of her existence, she compelled me to commit to a solitary objective. Track down the lady from the transit terminal. Inform her that she preserved my life. I positioned my palm directly over my lips. I had completely refrained from weeping inside that grand ballroom the previous evening. Not a single time did I shed a tear, not through the ambient mockery, the bidding process, or the sound of my own spouse's voice attaching a monetary value to my person. Yet I wept at this moment, shedding tears in a quiet fashion at a tiny table inside an eating establishment I had never previously visited, mourning a young girl I had nearly wiped from my mind and recognizing a massive obligation I never realized I was owed. The sum of $2 million was absolutely not an act of standard charity, Daniel articulated in a tender manner. I desire for you to completely comprehend that I did not perform that action for the benefit of your spouse's philanthropic organization, nor did I execute it simply to humiliate his character. Though I must admit, I harbored no objections if it resulted in his embarrassment. I performed it because for a span of 30 years, every single individual in your existence has determined your personal value without ever truly taking the time to observe you. I desired, just a single time, for a space packed with individuals to witness the absolute reality of the situation. I cleared my eyes using the tablecloth piece, my fingertips shaking slightly. I am completely at a loss for words. You are under no obligation to voice anything whatsoever tonight, he responded. Merely accept this item. He shifted the paper container toward my side of the table. It is a message from Rachel. She composed these words prior to passing away. In the event that I successfully located your whereabouts, I have refrained from reading the contents. It is absolutely not my property to review. I grasped the paper container using both of my hands, holding it as if it might completely disintegrate if I applied too much physical pressure. And I came to understand, remaining seated right there, with the small wax light burning down to a low level and the rainfall initiating once more against the glass panes of the eating establishment, that whatever resided within that message was going to entirely alter the configuration of my existence. I merely remained unaware of the true extent of that alteration. I unsealed the paper container completely alone inside the spare bedroom where I had chosen to sleep since the evening of the charity event, because I found it impossible to bring myself to read Rachel's concluding statements to me while Gregory's voice drifted continuously through the partition wall, inquiring repeatedly about the true nature of my connection to Daniel Whitmore. The script was tiny and executed with extreme precision, resembling the handwriting of a legal professional. The message initiated in a straightforward fashion: Respected Angela, if you are currently reviewing these words, my sibling has finally tracked you down, and I sincerely hope it did not transpire too late in your life. I desire for you to know that the lady who treated me to an evening meal on the absolute worst night of my existence transformed into the primary reason I maintained faith for the entirety of my remaining days that absolute strangers possess the capacity to be gentle. Absolutely everything I established, I constructed as a direct result of a solitary hour you likely harbor no active recollection of passing in my company. I have deposited explicit guidelines with my legal representatives. I sincerely trust you will receive what I am bequeathing to your person, not as a form of compensation because you never once requested a single thing, but as definitive proof that gentleness does not vanish from the world, it expands significantly. It simply requires a standard duration of time to circle back to its source. Affixed directly to the written message were official legal records that I found necessary to review 2 separate times before completely grasping their significance. Rachel had not merely bequeathed financial assets to my person. She had left me a professional role, a designated seat on the governing executive group of the philanthropic structure she had dedicated her existence to constructing, alongside an absolute commanding percentage of its operational pathway moving forward. This meant true leadership, an authentic sense of target, and an absolute voice in deciding the allocation of hundreds of thousands of dollars on an annual basis toward temporary housing, legal assistance, and educational funding for young individuals who mirrored the exact circumstances of the girl I had long ago treated to a diner meal. I remained seated upon the perimeter of that unfamiliar mattress for an extended duration, clutching records that abruptly caused my fingertips to feel as if they were the property of a completely different human being. Down on the lower level of the residence, Gregory was actively constructing a situation as well, though it failed to possess any element of generosity. He had secured the services of a confidential detective by the arrival of Wednesday, a gentleman going by the name of Foster who focused his skills, according to information shared by Margaret, strictly on matrimonial disputes. Gregory was completely certain, in the highly specific manner an individual carrying personal guilt is regularly certain of the misdeeds of alternative people, that Daniel and I maintained a lengthy background that he simply had failed to expose up to this point. He envisioned a romantic entanglement, something sufficiently scandalous to provide a logical explanation for a sum of $2 million and a confidential evening meal. He desired to secure definitive documentation prior to the moment I could, using his exact phrasing, catch him completely off guard in front of the legal professionals. What the detective Foster uncovered, instead, disrupted Gregory's composure to a far greater degree than a romantic entanglement ever could have accomplished. He located educational professionals I had performed duties alongside 2 decades in the past, individuals who distinctly recalled me maintaining nutritional snacks inside my administrative drawers for the benefit of young students who turned up for lessons facing starvation. He tracked down a lady going by the name of Diane, a grieving widow I had remained seated alongside on a weekly basis for a span of 2 years following the passing of her spouse, back during the era when Gregory was excessively consumed with establishing his corporate enterprise, to perceive that I had completely vanished on the majority of Tuesday afternoons. He located 3 individuals who had previously resided within the temporary care system, now fully matured, who characterized a lady who had consistently turned up to view their educational theatrical performances because absolutely no other individual bothered to show up. He discovered a military veteran going by the name of Harold, who attributed to my person, out of all imaginable people, the specific assistance that enabled him to locate the proper administrative branch that ultimately authorized his state support after the Veterans Office had rejected his applications 2 separate times. Absolutely none of the information was theatrical in nature. None of it constituted a public embarrassment. It was merely multiple decades composed of tiny, uncelebrated acts of gentleness that had never a single time entered into a discussion at Gregory's dining table, because I had never considered them sufficiently interesting to bring up in conversation, and he had never a single time inquired about what I did with the hours of my existence that were not explicitly dedicated to facilitating his own goals. The detective's completed dossier arrived directly on Gregory's workspace during the identical week that the recording went viral across the internet. I possess no knowledge regarding the identity of the person who captured the footage, likely a random attendee utilizing a mobile device, recording the bidding process in the exact manner individuals document absolutely everything these days, without giving it a secondary thought. Yet by the arrival of Thursday, the visual recording of Gregory clutching that sound equipment, smiling broadly, and uttering the phrases, "Let us open the bidding at $20, had been viewed a total of 4 million times. The text labels that individuals affixed to the footage were entirely unkind to his character. The public remarks left below were identical in nature. A broadcast comedian referenced the situation during his evening opening remarks. An internet profile focused on female advocacy redistributed the recording alongside the text label. This represents the exact appearance of routine brutality when it is outfitted in formal evening wear. And that specific interpretation by itself accumulated over 1 million views by the arrival of Friday morning. Corporate backers initiated telephone communications with the firm. 2 high-end property builders who had completed binding agreements with Gregory's company during the preceding spring season quietly requested their legal teams to look into the cancellation stipulations. A news reporter who had documented the charity event for a neighborhood commercial publication communicated with my person in a direct manner, requesting a public statement. And I chose to pass on the opportunity because I possessed no prepared remarks to offer and maintained absolutely no desire to articulate anything without proper preparation. Gregory returned to the residence on Friday evening, appearing exactly like a man who had put on 5 additional years of age over the span of 5 days. He refrained from inquiring about Daniel's actions. He did not ask about the paper container I had been highly attentive to keep secured inside the spare bedroom storage furniture. He remained seated at the central food preparation counter, with his mobile device positioned screen-side down in front of his hands, and remarked in a highly quiet tone, "The footage is absolutely everywhere, Angela. I am completely incapable of making it stop." I chose not to provide him with an immediate response. I reflected upon Rachel's written message situated on the upper level of the residence, considering the peculiar, serene strength of a single genuine hour passed in the company of a terrified stranger, and pondering how completely differently circumstances might have unfolded for Gregory if he had ever a single time across 27 years wondered about what I did with the hours of my own existence. The telephone device rang out prior to the moment I could finalize what to articulate. Gregory picked up the line, listened to the speaker for a prolonged duration, and I observed the remaining traces of color completely vanish from his face. "The governing group demands an urgent assembly," he stated. "Monday morning, every single one of them." The assembly of the governing group persisted for a total of 90 minutes. And Gregory related the details to my person that evening in disconnected pieces. In the exact manner a man characterizes a situation he remains too completely shocked to organize into a coherent, structured narrative. 7 executive heads remained seated around the extended table inside the glass-walled conference space he had previously felt immense pride regarding. The specific room possessing the vista of the docking area he enjoyed displaying to prospective corporate partners. And absolutely none of them, he explained, would look directly into his eyes. It was Bill Ashford, the most senior individual among the group, who ultimately articulated the thoughts the remaining members were harboring. "This situation is completely unrelated to the mere joke, Gregory. Comedic remarks receive absolution. This situation relates directly to what the comedic remark communicated to every single observer regarding who you truly are when you assume no individual of importance is monitoring your actions. Two of the high-end property builders who had been investigating cancellation stipulations throughout the week rendered their choices completely official by Monday afternoon. An accommodation enterprise that had been concluding a binding agreement for a fresh development project pulled out of the transaction entirely, referencing in the precise vocabulary utilized by legal professionals absolute worries regarding corporate image consistency. By the arrival of Wednesday, the firm's financial value, unlisted as it was, had dropped to a sufficient degree that Gregory completely ceased mentioning any specific values to my person whatsoever. He approached me on Thursday holding a broadcast media proposal in his grasp, a early morning program that desired for the two of them, Gregory and Angela Simmons, to sit side by side and correct the public record. He had already informed the media coordinator that he would participate. He requested my presence solely to offer smiles, to communicate to the audience that the event was a mere inside joke between the two of us, that I had suffered no emotional damage, and that our relationship was perfectly fine. I fixed my eyes upon him for a prolonged duration prior to articulating my response. I refuse to speak untruths for the benefit of any individual moving forward, Gregory, not even for your sake. He refrained from raising his voice. I believe a piece of his being had already ceased anticipating that I would volunteer an affirmative response to any request he presented. He merely sat down heavily upon a seat at the food preparation table and placed his face directly within his palms. And for the primary time in a longer duration than I could actively recall, I detected an element close to genuine pity for his circumstances, though it failed to possess enough strength to alter the response I had provided.